Hey everyone, and welcome to the Zone of Tech. I'm Daniel, and this is the iPad Air 2. And by now I'm guessing that most of you either own a tablet or know someone who owns one. But who do we have to thank for the existence of tablets? Well, in a way, we have to thank Steve Jobs for coming up with the original iPad back in 2010, only 4 years ago. But no, the iPad was not the first tablet. This is how tablets looked before the iPad. There were no more than just a few hundred models on the market, and they were really expensive. They were also underpowered, and most of them still used a resistive instead of a capacitive touchscreen, which, fun fact, was introduced back in 2007 with the introduction of the first generation iPhone. So, long story short, tablets before the iPad were awful. The iPad, however, was different in every single way. The first difference was that it was huge at 9.7 inches. The iPad, the first generation iPad, was one of the largest tablets on the market at that time. The second difference was that it ran a mobile operating system, so iOS, instead of a desktop one such as Windows XP. Windows XP was the main operating system, the one which was most used by most tablets out there and PDAs. Number 3 was the battery life. So the battery life on the iPad was and still is outstanding. Even the first generation managed to get about 10 hours of battery life. That's continuous usage, not standby time, so 10 hours, and that's how much battery life the iPad Air 2 gets. So yeah, same battery life over, 4 years. They did, however, make them thinner and thinner with each generation, but yeah, the battery life has stayed the same. 10 hours for every single iPad, even the iPad mini. So yeah, 10 hours compared to 3 to 4 hours, which most of the tablets, most of the competition out there back in 2010 used to get. And finally, the fourth difference between the iPad and the other tablets out there was the performance. The iPad was blazing fast. So since it ran a mobile operating system and had a really nice Apple A4 chip inside, the iPad was really fast compared to the competition out there, which ran Windows XP, had a really slow chip inside, and they were almost all of them, all the PDAs, GPS systems, everything was laggy, choppy, and almost, a pain to use. Without almost. They were a pain to use. Actually, let me know in the comment section down below if you remember using a tablet before the iPad, and if you do, can you remember how choppy, how laggy everything was? Especially the touchscreen, since most of them had a resistive touchscreen and you have to, press it as hard as you can to make it work. Oh, I clicked something else. That's how they were. Yeah. So this is why the iPad was so successful and why every single tech company today now has their own tablet. Samsung has one, actually way more than one. Just take a look at this. It's insane. A lot of tablets, and you have no idea which one to choose from. So yeah, Samsung has a lot of tablets, LG has a couple, Google has a couple. Actually, Google, they only have one tablet right now, which is the Nexus 9. And this one, they discontinued the Nexus 7 and the Nexus 10. By the way, Nexus 9 review coming in a few days, so stay tuned for the full review of the Nexus 9. Now, going back to the iPad, a year after its introduction, they introduced the iPad 2, which is actually this one right here. This is not a first generation, this is the second generation, the iPad 2. So the second generation iPad was significantly thinner than the first one. Finally had a back-facing camera, although it was just 0.7 megapixels and it couldn't autofocus, so it was fixed focus. But at the same time, it was significantly faster than the first generation iPad. Then the following year, they introduced the iPad 3, the third generation iPad, which finally came with a Retina display. Apple also improved the back-facing camera from 0.7 megapixels to 5 megapixels, autofocus, video recording, 1080p video recording, and all that kind of stuff. It was actually the same camera that the iPhone 4 used. So yeah, huge improvement in the camera department and in the display. Although because of the Retina display, they had to increase the battery size, and the iPad 3 was significantly thicker than the iPad 2. So the iPad 3 was almost as thick as the iPad 1, which is quite weird. They went back with this, but yeah. Then came the iPad 4, only a few months after the introduction of the iPad 3, which made a lot of users really angry. They introduced the iPad 4 to fix the sluggishness of the iPad 3, since to be honest, the chip, the A5X chip, combined with the Retina display, made the iPad 3 actually slower than the iPad 2 and the iPad 1. So the iPad 3 was the slowest iPad on the market, so that's why they introduced the 4th generation iPad, and they also introduced the Lightning connector with that, and they upgraded the front-facing camera to an HD front-facing camera, and that was pretty much it. After that, they introduced the iPad 5, or the iPad Air, as Apple likes to call it. So the iPad Air was significantly thicker than the iPad 3 and the iPad 4, which had the same thickness, although it wasn't significantly thinner than the iPad 2, because remember, the iPad 3 and 4 were thicker than the second iPad, which was thinner. So yeah, anyway, the iPad Air was still thinner, just a bit thinner than the iPad 2. So yeah, first major redesign since the second generation iPad, the iPad 2. And now they've introduced the iPad Air 2, the second generation iPad Air. So let's take a look at the iPad Air 2, the second generation Air, and see what new feature it comes with, and also how it stands out from the competition. This is my iPad Air 2 in-depth review. God, this was a really long intro. Enjoy. So there are 4 major changes that come with the new iPad Air 2. And those changes are in terms of its design, display, performance, and cameras. Starting off with the design, the first design change is that it's thinner. 18% thinner actually than the already incredibly thin iPad Air. In fact, at only 6.1 millimeters thin, it's not just the thinnest tablet in the world right now, but it's also thinner than the thinnest flagship smartphone out there, the iPhone 6. And at 437 grams or 0.96 pounds, it is also extremely light. This is incredibly useful for students like myself. Instead of carrying a 15-inch laptop or, 5 heavy books with you at uni, you can simply put an iPad Air 2 in your bag packed with 1,000 virtual books, and it all weighs less than a single book. Amazing, isn't it? Like honestly, with just my iPad in my bag, it's like carrying an empty bag. That's how light it is. And since it is so light, you can easily hold it in one hand and type with the other. Something which you could not do with the previous models because of their weight. Now, besides the thinness and the weight loss, the Air 2 now comes in a brand new color, gold, besides the already existing silver and space gray colors. So we now get the same color scheme as with the iPhone. We also no longer get a mute or rotation lock switch on the side like we did with all the previous iPad models. This is now done entirely through the operating system. The speakers have also been redesigned. Besides the new speaker grille, they are also significantly louder. In fact, when you max out the volume, the entire iPad will vibrate. That's what happens when you add powerful speakers to such a thin tablet. Phone, start browsing from your Mac, and open up the same Safari webpage on your iPad, and yeah, you get the idea. But hey, the speakers are awesome, so I have nothing to complain about. In fact, here's how they sound against something like the Google Nexus 9. Enjoy. Apple also included the all-new Touch ID sensor, a first for the iPad, which means that you can now unlock your iPad by simply touching the home button with your finger. You can also pay for apps in the App Store, and even use Apple Pay, at least the online bit, all with just your fingerprint, which is quite impressive. Off Tech, signing out. Cheers. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comment section down below. Finally, the final design change lies within the home button, which finally comes with a Touch ID sensor. So last year when Apple introduced the iPhone 5S, its main feature was the Touch ID sensor. However, although the iPad Air 1 and the iPad Mini 2 were introduced after the iPhone 5S, they did not come with such a thing. And to be honest, after you get used to the iPhone's Touch ID home button, it feels extremely weird picking up the iPad just to notice that, the Touch ID sensor is simply not there. The good news, however, is that we finally have it. So, just like with the iPhone 5S, the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus, you can now unlock your iPad by simply using your fingerprint. You can also pay for apps in the App Store and even use Apple Pay, at least the online bit. Since going to the store and saying, hey, can I pay with my iPad? Can I scan this, please? I won't even comment on that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. There's nothing more you can do with a Touch ID sensor other than unlocking your iPad, paying for apps in the App Store, or paying for goods in certain apps with Apple Pay. With iOS 8, Apple released the Touch ID API to the developers, meaning that third-party apps can now take full advantage of it. So I'm actually curious of how this will evolve in the future, because right now, we don't have a lot of apps that take full advantage of the Touch ID sensor. A multi-user / account would have been extremely useful with this, but at the time speaking, it's not here. So let's hope for something like this in iOS 9. The second big change is the display itself. So long story short, this display is dead gorgeous. We have the exact same high resolution 2048 by 1536 IPS display that we got with the previous iPad Air, coming in at 264 ppi, but with two major upgrades. The first upgrade is that the display is now laminated onto the glass. So what this means is that number one, there's no air gap between the display, the digitizer, and the glass. And by the way, the digitizer is the touchscreen, so there's no air gap between those three. Everything is just one piece. And two, this is by far the most immersive experience you will ever see on a tablet. Whenever you are using this, it actually feels as if you were touching the pixels. That's how good it is. So here's an iPad mini 3 display which is not laminated, and now here's the iPad Air 2's display which is laminated. Not only are the colors more vivid, but there's a huge difference between the two. Whenever I go back to the mini, or to any previous generation iPads for that matter, it feels as if there was a 2 or 3 millimeters gap or empty space between the glass and the actual display. However, on the iPad Air 2 it feels a lot more immersive. I mean, this is something you actually have to see for yourself in person to realize how good it is, so a trip to the Apple Store would be a pretty good idea. The second display upgrade is this new reflective coating, which reduces glare up to 56%, especially useful when used outdoors. In fact, this is the least reflective tablet on the market right now, making it one of the best, if not actually the best tablet to be used outdoors, especially because of its lightweight, great battery life, and performance. And speaking of the performance, the third major change comes in how powerful this thing is. So the Air 2 now packs Apple's all-new 3-core A8X CPU, which is a true beast. It's 64-bit, same as last year's A7, but now it's actually 40% faster in terms of the CPU performance and 2.5 times faster in terms of the GPU performance or the graphics. This means that apps will launch in a matter of milliseconds, games will look and run great, basically everything in terms of the user experience is flawless. The Air 2 is also Apple's first iOS device to ship with 2 GB of RAM. Now, iOS devices don't actually need a large amount of RAM since the operating system was pretty well optimized, and even last year's iPad Air 1 with just a gigabyte of RAM was already incredibly fluid, and you know, the same goes for the iPhones, which also come with just a gig of RAM. However, I'm a bit disappointed that Apple didn't come up with some magical multi-window mode for this. I mean, come on, it has 2 GB of RAM and there's literally nothing that takes full advantage of that extra gig of memory. Of course, you can now keep more apps open in the background, but other than that, everything is exactly the same as on the iPad Air 1 or even the previous iPad models. The operating system is simply just a blown up iPhone interface, since there's literally nothing that takes full advantage of that extra screen real estate. Although I have a feeling that Apple is planning something big with the iPad in terms of multitasking. Just wait until March 2015 and you'll see what I mean. The good news, however, is that the Apple A8X CPU is incredibly thermally efficient. My iPad never got hot, not even when playing intensive 3D games, such as Hearthstone for example, or even when doing some video or audio work. The Nexus 9, however, which, in case you've seen my initial impressions video, you know that it does get pretty hot, even with just some lightweight gaming. Finally, the A8X CPU is also a lot more power efficient than the A7X. In fact, because of this, Apple managed to reduce the battery capacity by 15%, bringing the total capacity down to 7,340 mAh. So this is how they managed to come up with such a thin profile. They reduced the battery size and they also laminated the display. And speaking of the battery, although it's 15% smaller, I haven't noticed any reduction in terms of the battery life. I still get those insane 10 hours of usage, actually sometimes even more than 10 hours, and that even more insane standby time. So just to give you an idea, you can leave your iPad unused, untouched for 2 weeks with 95% battery life, and when you come back you'll still have 91% battery life. That's how insane it is. I'm actually curious of how this will perform against the MacBook Air, especially the 11-inch MacBook Air, since they're both extremely portable computers. They both pretty much have the same size, one of them is a tablet and one of them is a full-fledged computer, so be sure to hit that like button down there if you would like to see that comparison in a future video. And finally, the fourth and final improvement lies within the camera department. The front-facing camera received a pretty major upgrade. It now uses a larger f2.2 aperture to let more light in, and it can now take HDR photos as well as HDR videos. In fact, it is now the exact same front-facing camera that you get with the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus. So 1.2 megapixels resolution with 720p video. Moving to the back-facing camera, here's where the magic begins. The sensor has been upgraded from a 5 to an 8 megapixel one. We also get 120 frames per second slow motion capabilities, time-lapse capabilities, capabilities, 1080p video recording, burst mode, basically everything you would get with an iPhone 5S. In fact, the only difference between this camera and the iPhone 5S's camera is that the Air 2's camera features a smaller f2.4 aperture instead of the f2.2 one that we get with the iPhone 5S. Everything else is exactly the same. And I have to agree, the photos look amazing. I mean, just take a look at those shots. The contrast is perfect, the exposure is even more perfect. None of my shots were over or underexposed. Even the nighttime shots look pretty decent. Keep in mind that this is just a tablet, not a smartphone, and definitely not a DSLR camera. And the photos still look amazing. So if you're that guy who takes photos with a tablet on a regular basis, then this is by far the best camera in the tablet department that you can get. So as a conclusion, the iPad Air 2 improves on the already perfect iPad Air. And to be honest, there's literally nothing missing from it. Or even more for that matter, nothing that needs to be changed. I mean, you get an incredible thin design, an even more incredible display, and some amazing performance along with, two of the best cameras out there for a tablet, if you're that kind of guy. So overall, this is not just the best tablet that Apple has made, but the best tablet that anyone has made. Like, honestly, there's no true competitor to the iPad, not even after 4 years, which is quite surprising, to be honest. Yes, the Nexus 9 is a pretty decent approach from Google, but it still lacks in many departments, and more about that in my full Nexus 9 review. So yeah, the iPad Air 2 is a great tablet. So if you're looking for a tablet, both the iPad Air 2 and the iPad Air 1, so the third generation iPad Air, which by the way is $100 cheaper than the Air 2, both of them are pretty good options. Really good options, actually. So yeah, this has been it. Hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button down there. Helps out the channel. And yeah, I'll see you in my next video. And by the way, in the meantime, let me know in the comment section down below what's your favorite tablet. What's your daily tablet driver? What's your tablet of choice if you have one and you use one daily? Let me know in the comment section down below. Because, I'm curious to know. Haha, that was a pretty good rhyme. Never mind. So yeah, thank you all for watching this video. I'm Daniel, no idea why I'm laughing, and I'll see you in my next video. Xenotech, signing out. Cheers.